Hello, I'm Justin. Welcome to the Video Creators Lounge podcast. We're recording here in our studios in Melrose, Massachusetts. Our podcast topics fall into various threads, one of which is a focus on nonprofits and those doing important work to help our communities. That is why I'm happy to introduce Scott Larson, who along with his wife, Hanne, founded Straight Ahead Ministries in 1987 to provide care, outreach, opportunities, support, and so much more for juvenile offenders all over New England. Scott, welcome. I'm so happy you joined us here today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I had a terrific opportunity to meet with Jason Ludwig recently on a previous podcast that will be airing soon. And what a pleasure it was. He told me a lot about Straight Ahead Ministries from his perspective, but I would love to hear from your perspective, being the founder, you along with your wife. Could you tell me a little bit about Straight Ahead Ministries, the mission, and how you got involved?
Yeah, well, you talked to the expert, Jason, and the young people are the experts on it. I have the privilege of serving to make a platform for most of them, and they're the ones who really are the story and continue to make the story. But Straight Ahead really exists to provide opportunities for young people who are caught up in this system of the juvenile justice system, both to encounter hope while they're locked up, and we do provide the faith-based programs for hundreds of juvenile facilities at a key time in kids' life, but then we continue to work with them when they get back into their communities. Some say, well, that's where their work really begins. But a lot of the powerful things really happen in some of the worst places, which is often juvenile detention. So our work really starts when kids are in lockup. And people may not know, but over 2 million young people, youth, are arrested in the United States every year. And there's about 1,300 facilities where kids are locked up. So some of them are large facilities, some are quite small. Here in Massachusetts, we have 40 of them. In Maine, there's one, but it's a bigger one where a lot of kids are. And kids will be in there, I've seen as young as 10 and as old as 21. And it's a pretty disturbing time in a person's life. You can imagine if it was your child who was put into there with a lot of other kids that you wonder, is this going to be safe? What's going to happen to him or her? And it's a key time because, well, all the distractions are removed from their lives. They're open, sometimes like no other time, to really a change. This isn't working very well. And there are very few people who come in and see them who aren't paid to see them. And a lot of times kids, they like the worst thing you could be called would be a therapist, for example, people who are working on me. And then we have the opportunity to come in just as people from the community. And we run Bible discussion groups, we run recovery groups, we run all kinds of stuff, but it's all a context to develop a relationship with a young person, with a healthy adult. And for many of them, it's like the first time they've had that kind of person. I remember a young kid, Ricky, telling me, do you know Rick and Lori? And I said, yeah, I do know them. They were the Bible study leaders where he was locked up. And he said, well, they're just like my parents, And I said, really? How's that? He said, well, it was just my birthday last week. Oh, happy birthday. Yeah, I didn't get any cards. There was no party or anything. I didn't get any visits that day, but I did get a card from Rick and Lori. And they remembered my birthday. Said, they're just like my parents. And sometimes it takes these kids a long time to trust, but when you win that trust, they have an enormous amount of loyalty, to where Ricky would say, Rick and Lori are like my parents. And now when he gets out and Rick and Lori may be there, or somebody that's like him or somebody that's like them, they're in a position to have a big impact on that young person's life.
That's interesting how they relate. You had mentioned 2 million juveniles worldwide in the United States.
Yeah, 2 million arrested every year in the United States.
2 million arrested every year. And what does that break down to in Massachusetts, you think, roughly, approximately?
Yeah, Massachusetts, I don't know exact number that are arrested. There's, at any given time, usually about 800 that are held in confinement in 40 different institutions here. And so, we go in and we run groups with those kids while they're there, get to know them. And about a third to maybe 40% come out to the programs that we run. And sometimes people wonder, well, I don't know how you could run religious programs, isn't there a separation of church and state and that type of thing? And Yes, but when you hold somebody in confinement, you have to provide for them religious services if they want it. And that's the key. It's voluntary.
Sure.
We have to be interdenominational, so we're not one particular church who comes in and we just come in and we talk about real life things, habits, hurts, fears, anger, and how can God help us with these things? And kids who have experienced a lot of trauma, like the kids in the system, they tend to be more probably spiritually attuned than the average teenager, maybe even the average of us out there. Because when you're going through pain and tough things, you're asking bigger questions. What's the meaning of life? Why am I here? Why is this happening? And you tend to look outside yourself a bit. And that's what we see with young people who are in the system.
You had mentioned that some children are as young as 10 years old.
Yeah.
And that's usually the youngest. It's very young.
Yeah.
Do they separate children in different groups, or are they all kind of in this same facility?
Yeah, I mean, 10 is young. Most kids aren't 10 years old who are in there, but I've seen kids as young as 10. But they don't separate them. No, they'll go into a detention center and then wait, for their arraignment to go to court and see what's going to happen with them. And generally, they've been arrested 3 to 5 different times before they really get put into the system and become a part of it. But, research says 17 is the highest crime committing age in our culture, that 90% of 17-year-olds self-report committing a crime they could be arrested for. So if you have a 17-year-old, it's a 90% chance that they've done something they could be arrested for.
No kidding.
Yeah, well, testosterone levels peak out for boys at 17, which is not great news for me or you.
Right.
We're on the down from there. The group think is sort of at its height. The prefrontal cortex of the brain, the logical brain, the part that can, make long-term decisions, very well, that can take concrete information like the Bible or rules and apply it to abstract situations like Friday night. That part of the brain isn't fully functioning until 25 at the best. That's why you can't rent a car till you're 25 in this country, though you can go to war at 18. More and more, we're thinking of adolescence as 21, even 25 years old, but at 17, you're put into a system that was really designed for the worst case of people. And so, they find that 2/3 of those who are in a lot of trouble at 17 are doing fine by age 30, depending on how involved they got with the so-called helping system.
What is the helping system?
Well, the social services, the justice system, and the more they were involved with the helping system, the less chance that they'll be doing well by age 30. It's
the more chance that the greater chance, is that correct?
The greater chance
that they'll be doing well.
That they won't be doing well.
I'm sorry, so I'm confused.
Yeah.
You said that the more they're involved with the help system, the less they are likely to do well in their 30s.
Yeah. And
that's shocking to me.
It is.
Wait a minute. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, it is pretty shocking. Well, the biggest contributors to mental illness and breakdown in adolescence are large numbers of antisocial peers in a non-nurturing environment, i.e. a group home or a detention center.
Okay.
And we know this research-wise. It's, politically right and left have come to agree that this is not a good investment of money. It costs, anywhere between $250 upward of $350 a day to keep a kid in confinement, and they tend to get worse in there. There's a lot of deviance coaching from other kind of kids. It's not a nurturing environment. It's antisocial peers. And the more kids tend to get caught up in that system, the less chance they'll be doing well by age 30. And so the trend now has been, well, let's just keep them out of there then. And so we're not sending near as many into lockup as we did in the past. That we peaked out in this country, just a few years ago, where now we have 1 out of every 4 prisoners in the world is in the United States, even though we only have 5% of the world's population.
Sure.
1 out of every 3 women who's in prison in the world. The downside of that is that we're really not replacing those dollars to really help kids with the core issues that get them into trouble. The conduct that gets people into trouble is really now what we're understanding to be trauma-based behavior or pain-based behavior. Hurt people hurt people. So when you have a lot of trauma in juvenile offenders, 87% say they've either been shot or shot at. 67%
Wow.
have witnessed a homicide. So 2/3 have witnessed a homicide.
Wow.
And they have virtually the same rates of PTSD as those who came back from the Iraq War, except it's really not so much a post-traumatic stress disorder as an ongoing stress, because home and the environment they live in is the traumatic experience for most of them. It's not like you left it and now you're in a safe environment. And you combine that with adolescence, and that's a pretty toxic formula for a lot of young people, the ones who end up being in this system anyway.
Interesting. I'm surprised because I know you work so hard within these facilities, and I guess you can't wave a magic wand and change them to different types of facilities or programs that you believe would be best, but it's not as helpful as it could be, I guess, is a nicer way of putting it.
Yeah, some are better than others. Sometimes getting more services is better than getting no services. But taking kids and removing them from the supports around them, whether they're in school or their family, some of those sort of things, and then placing them into another environment where they're with mostly antisocial peers is not a great formula. And yet we find that it also, on the flip side of that, is a great opportunity for kids to take a look at where I'm going and what it is that I want and where I want to be, and big shifts are made for young people. And I think that's the part that somebody coming in and offering spiritual solutions and a relationship to walk alongside that young person when they get out is what plants seeds anyway. Sometimes they don't come up for a long time later. But I now, being in this for 3 decades and more, meet people almost every week at different things that I'm at that were part of something, that we were doing when they were a kid. And they may not have been ready at 16 or 17, but if you haven't seen a lot of positivity, it makes an impact. So, later on, you're in your early 20s and now you're in sometimes a worse place, or you're maybe in an adult prison, as was the case with Jason, who you interviewed last time. And then you're like, well, what was really working? What was different than this? I'm really ready now. In any kind of recovery work, we talk about the bottom, and that can be a long way down. But the way up is some hope that I've seen come my way.
It doesn't surprise me that what you believe is most helpful is forming personal relationships with people that are living a healthy lifestyle, that are healthy in body, mind, spirit. And that's what you're trying to bring, or that's what you do bring to the children.
Yeah, and it obviously not perfect people, but what we try to do is be a conduit between faith communities, who is one of the few places out in our culture that's intergenerational. So many things are segmented by just age and demographic and everybody like me. A healthy church body or parish has people of all different ages and socioeconomic background and employers and all the kind of people that we all need of a community. And we try to connect them into facilities where kids are, and go through screening and go through training so that they can do not destructive kind of things, because you can definitely be destructive coming in there. And there's rules about how you're in there. And then ideally, when that young person gets out, they have somebody to connect into, and their family can connect into. And, 92% of juveniles and adults in prison, when you ask them, well, what do you need when you get out? They'll say a job. I just need a job. And that's true. We have started businesses to employ people when they come out, because nothing stops a bullet like a job, as it's been said, and I agree with that. But I've gotten a lot of people jobs and apartments and all that who couldn't sustain them. Mm-hmm. And then, they burn through it, because that seems like the magic bullet. When you talk to people who've been out for a year successfully and ask them, what was it that you'd say most contributed to your success, they'll always say a relationship. I was connected to so-and-so. And then I'd got a job and I may have gotten an apartment and all those kind of things. But if you don't have a relational connection, the other's not going to hold you. That's just been my experience. And so we want to connect them to people. And that's why we also work, a lot of our staff have come up through, because you only need to see somebody who's a couple steps ahead of you. Sometimes an old person like me, it's like, well, that's just not, I'm not going to be like that. That's not me. But somebody who's a couple steps ahead, I can see, well, there's a direction there that I can go.
The key always seems to be personal relationships.
Yeah.
And the worst thing you can do is isolate. And we've also been reading a lot of articles in the news about just people in general being lonely and what the impact of that is overall, not just to people that have been in a juvenile detention center or locked away in prison. It seems like everyone should just be aware of that today in general.
Yeah, the book Chasing the Scream on addiction said, well, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And that's why recovery groups all know that, it's a community, it's a sponsor. We're wounded in relationship and we heal in relationship. It's not rocket science. But our culture has become much more disconnected than we ever were generations ago, too. When I grew up, we knew everybody in our neighborhoods. We had no fences in our backyard. And if my parents didn't discipline me, the neighbor would if they saw me doing something. It was just a different time. We don't have that same time that we live in today. And so how to have natural, healthy relationships is a challenge. And I think it's become challenging in some ways because of the system, especially in our urban communities where we've incarcerated so many men, African American, Latino men disproportionately. Though the crime levels may not be much different, the arrest and incarceration levels are much different. And so some cities, Baltimore, Detroit, upwards of close to 50% of African American or Latino men between 18 and 28 are on probation, in prison, or on parole. That destroys communities.
Can you say that statistic one more time?
That in many urban communities, disproportionately, they are arrested and confined. Though rates of crime may not be enormously different, by being black or brown, your chance of being arrested for that same crime and given longer sentences are 17 times more than if you're white. So we know that when a community has more than 2% of its population incarcerated, it starts to become more dangerous. Now, when you have some communities where half the men are either in prison on probation or awaiting trial, this really disrupts a community. And so the solutions are individual, help this person, but they also require a systemic reordering, institutional racism. Where we have our offices in Worcester, we're in a particular area called Maine South. And I would say the main industry in our community is drug addiction. We've got, we take people into rehabs, detoxes for 3 to 5 days, put them into a program at the most now 2 weeks. Used to be 3-month programs, then they were 21 days, now they're 2 weeks. And so then they get out back on the street at about 19 or 20 days sober, clean. We know that at 21 days sober, your serotonin levels bottom out at your worst time. Right when you're going into, on the same community, a sober house. Now, all these things are funded, through public dollars generally, especially for people who are on the streets. You're at your most vulnerable time. Now, nobody's up there saying, let's keep addiction going. But every system is designed to get the result it gets. In prisons, when there's an 80% return rate, I tell young guys in prison all the time, listen, as long as you keep coming back, you're worth a lot of money. The U.S. government says that it costs about $2.1 million when somebody drops out of school at age 16 and enters a lifetime of crime. That's a lot of money that people are making off of one person who stays in crime. And if you got an 80% return rate, you're a businessman. You know that's a good business. If you can get 80% return, and when kids can start to see that, like, wow, I don't want to be part of this formula. Mm-hmm. And you know what keeps them there? I'll say a lot of times, the advice, quit doing drugs, quit using, quit getting kicked out of school, quit being in the gang. That's almost a sure formula to keep you coming back.
So, wow, you've said a lot here. Let's unpack it. When you speak of the returns, are you only speaking of the private prisons, or do the federally funded or state-funded prisons also have this mentality in terms of operating it like a business?
Well, I don't think anybody's doing it intentionally, except for private prisons. You know, that's a whole other thing.
Is that pervasive in Massachusetts?
We have a lot of private prisons? We have a lot of private nonprofits that run programs, you know, for the state, that have contracts with the state. We don't have privatized. Recently that was brought back in, that federal prisons can be privatized. Some of these are traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and now they've gotten into ankle bracelets and everything else. It's a big industry. But, to me, being a man of faith, whenever you see a system that gets to be bigger than that it can't afford to fail, you'd sort of say, in the Bible it talks about there's powers and principalities at work under these things. And it's almost a demonic realm, I would say, that pushes this stuff. And the people who suffer are the ones who are poor and who are the disadvantaged. So I don't think there's anybody out there, or even people who work in these facilities, will say, let's just get these guys back again.
Right. So
but if you take the assumption that every system is designed to get the result it gets, it's set up to keep 80% coming back. And when I said the way you keep people coming back is you give them the advice, don't do it anymore. We know from brain research that just doesn't work.
Well, that was a big thing in the 80s. Just don't.
That's right.
Well, just don't do it.
Just don't do it.
Just say no.
Say no.
Right.
Nancy Reagan. It's like telling your 3-year-old, don't jump in that puddle. Well, they're all in, right? Your brain doesn't process don't. Plus,
it's kind of the difference between don't spill the milk or pour the milk nicely.
Yeah. Right? It's like driving a car looking backwards. If I'm focused on what I'm trying to get away from, I'm not going to get very far away from it. So we work a lot on what is it you want, a bigger yes rather than just all the things you're going to say no to. And this is actually quite a despairing crisis for a lot of young people, is to start to dream and think about what I want, because, what if I'm disappointed? What if it doesn't work? And yet, until you can get a vision in somebody, and it's already in them, but uncover, what is it you want? And sometimes it's when I have a child now, I have a son, something bigger than them, that's because they don't think they're worth it for themselves, but who's dependent on me, and have a relationship, I'm dependent on them, a big enough reason for me to start to move in this direction rather than this one, because this is familiar. And I'm always going to be prone back to what I can predict, even if I complain about it all day long. To break free from that requires, it's a transformational process, and that's really what our mission statement is about, is transformation. We say to see Jesus transform the lives of juvenile offenders, but this transformation process is not the incremental, behavior modification kind of thing. It requires a real shift in a person's whole way of being.
You have dedicated your life towards helping specifically juvenile offenders. Your ministry, you personally go into the detention centers all the time to work with children. You see them sometimes before, many times during, and then after as well. Is it hard to spend so much time working with children in a facility that if you could wave a magic wand, you would completely change?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not smart to change the whole thing, but we do know, what works, and we know what doesn't work. A lot of European countries, take Finland, for example, they were one of the worst incarceration rates, like the Russian gulag, and they decided, some decades ago that this wasn't working for them, and they went to work to research what works with people. And they ended up taking all the fences out around the prisons, and the guards became more like teachers, and the students and the inmates were pupils, and they had a relationship, and they followed them when they got out. And they went from amongst the highest incarceration rates in Western Europe to the very lowest, one of the lowest in the world. In Germany, when you go in and you get locked up, from day one you begin to work on what's your reintegration plan? How do we get your family involved? We're not trying to make you suffer in here like punishment is going to make all of a sudden a well person. Punishment comes from the Latin word pane, which means pain. So you wouldn't think that adding more pain to a person's pain is going to produce something well on the other side. Doesn't make any sense.
Not at all.
But we've politicized this over the last decade. Nobody wants to be soft on crime. God forbid that. So some other countries it hasn't been as politicized, and they've just been able to do what they know works. And it's happening here too. There are states in Missouri, Massachusetts was one of the states that was most innovative in changing from what used to be the training school in Westboro, Massachusetts, the first one in the country, right near where I live, to deinstitutionalizing that big facility and putting young people into smaller facilities. So we've made steps as we've begun to understand adolescence and the human brain. And there's a big study put out, Hardwired to Connect, it was called. And it said that the brain is hardwired to connect in relationship. And that that's the only way people change is in relationship. Now we have some science and research behind that the adolescent brain is in process, and that somebody at 16 or 15 is not the same as someone at 25, so we shouldn't punish them that way. We put tens of thousands of minors with life sentences into prison, and I know many of those who were sentenced that way. Now the Supreme Court has said, no, that's unconstitutional. And I know several.
When you say minors, how young have you seen that?
15.
You've seen a life sentence for a 15-year-old?
Yeah, 14.
Oh,
I know one young man who at 16.
I knew it was young. I didn't know it was as young as 14, 15.
Yeah, I knew a young man who was 16. In fact, there's two that committed the same crime from the same city in Lowell at 16. One was 15, one was 16. And one got life without parole, and the other got tried as a juvenile. And the one who got life without parole got out 2 years ago after 27 years. And we started to work with him again. We've been in touch all the way through. Now he's married, doing extremely well. But you can imagine 27 years away. The other one got tried as a juvenile. He had a good lawyer. And he's now a lawyer and the chairman of our board and my boss. And manages a $40 million budget working with youth in his state.
That is amazing. That's a huge success story. So the lawyer in that case really having a good representation in that particular case really made a big difference. Huh?
Well, we've evolved, so this would have been in the 1980s and 90s. It used to be that, if you commit crimes, even heinous crimes, we want to try you as a juvenile and see what we can do. Then it changed to be, well, unless you can prove that they can't be treated in the juvenile system. And then it changed again to be, well, you're going to be treated as an adult unless it can be proven that you can be treated as a juvenile. And that was the case for this young man. They both could have gone that way, but at the same time, one got life without parole and the other got tried as a juvenile. And then he lived in our home for 2 years when he got out at age 18. Then the law shifted again to now for these 5, 6, 7 crimes, including murder, but a lot of, not to diminish murder, but juvenile delinquents are different than when you and I were growing up. They're the littlest kids, but they all got guns, right? Mm-hmm. And you put guns together with drugs together with group think kind of stuff together.
Sure.
And it's a deadly toxic combination. So now these kids automatically go to adult prison. And sentences were very, very high and long.
They do now automatically, or you said
They
there's
do,
less of that.
they do, yeah. But now it's unconstitutional to give life without parole to somebody under 18. The Supreme Court ruled that a couple of
When
years
was that?
ago.
A couple of years ago?
Yeah, a few years ago.
And what was your reaction when you heard that?
Well, I was grateful for it.
It's really a shift of thinking between seeing prisons as a house of punishment as opposed to a house of rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Is it-
Yeah, a big part of what we work a lot on is helping to change the narrative of who these kids are. You think about it, when people started to talk about human trafficking instead of prostitutes, people wanted to get involved just by a simple change of, I mean, who wants to go help a prostitute? But when you think about people caught up in human trafficking, every church, every group wants to stop human trafficking.
Interesting.
And so I think, even the term juvenile offender is a derogatory, deficit-based term, isn't it? Because, I mean, who do you call juveniles? You don't say, hey, I want to introduce you to my 15-year-old juvenile son.
Sure, sure.
And so we begin to think in terms of justice-involved youth, or young people who are caught up in the justice system. And the narrative of who these kids are, has really been changed for me completely. The reason I got into this, I was a stockbroker 35 years ago and began to feel a calling to work with leadership youth. I wanted to work with young people who were leaders and could make a difference. And
I was just about to ask you exactly how just going to roll into that. So you were a stockbroker.
Yeah.
And then something happened. What was that thing that happened?
Yeah. So, it was the first of many midlife crises. I was in my mid-20s and I was like, well, if this is all there is, I'm not sure it's enough for me. It wasn't a bad thing I was doing, but it wasn't, it wasn't a big enough purpose. It's often said you learn what it is to be a man from your father, or even if he didn't tell you. And my father was always, it's to make a lot of money. He never made a lot of money, but I knew that was what it was if you were going to really be a man. And so I made a lot of money in my very early 20s as a stockbroker. And then it was like, wow, I'm not sure this is enough for me. And I started to volunteer with a local youth ministry with high school kids. And that began to be what was stirring my passion and my interest much more than my job was even. And so that was led me on a track of, I want to work with kids who are leadership kids. And I left my job, went to seminary, never thinking I was going to be a pastor. That wasn't in the, but I wanted to understand the spiritual solutions to some of these things with kids. And my wife was doing this kind of work before me. And when we moved to Massachusetts from Minnesota, she got an experiment in 1987 to lead a Bible study in a juvenile facility here in Massachusetts. They didn't allow such things in those days. And I thought that was nice. It was a great thing, but it wasn't my interest. I wanted to work with leadership youth. Mm-hmm. So there was one week where
What is leadership youth?
Well, I was, good question. Those who are going someplace, young people with that are going to make a difference, leaders. And so I had never been in a juvenile jail. And then when her Bible study leader was gone on vacation a couple of weeks, she said, well, can you come in with me? And, how are you going to tell your wife no? You can go in there on your own. And, I didn't know what these kids were like, but I'm imagining, they're violent, they're criminals, they're thugs, whatever. And so I went in there, and first kid that comes up to me, his name was Ricky. And he says, can you pray for me? Are you the Bible study leader? I said, yeah. Can you pray for me? Okay, what do you want to pray for? Well, I got court tomorrow. I'm like, okay, so you're trying to beat the case, I'm sure. And he's like, no, pray that I tell the truth. I said, oh, have you talked to your lawyer about this? He said, yeah, my lawyer swore at me when I told him I wanted to tell the truth. And I said, how come? He said, because you told me I could do 20 years in adult prison. And I said, well, Ricky, God can do anything, but you can't be thinking he's just going to get you out of here because you plead guilty? And he said, no, I didn't think it was going to get me out of here, but I've been reading this Bible you guys gave me. It says you're supposed to tell the truth. And I'm like, yeah, that's a good point, but wow, I didn't know what to tell him, He's only 15. He could do 20 years if he pleads guilty. His lawyer told him.
So this is in the 80s. In the 80s, you remember?
This was in 1987.
And even then, a 15-year-old. We talked about it before, but it's still hard to believe that a 15-year-old had a life sentence.
But 20 years, yeah.
Wow. Okay, so now you're in a little bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, so I was definitely praying, but my commitment was to go in for 1 week. Now I went in the next week to see what happened to him, and he's there. I said, well, what happened? Did you go to court? Yeah. Did you plead guilty? Yeah. What'd your lawyer say? Well, he swore at me. Then why are you here? He said, because my sentencing is going to be in 5.5 months in the Superior Court. And so now he's just a little kid, his mother had moved from Worcester to New York. He's a Puerto Rican kid. And so I kept going in to help him get ready for 5.5 months, what's going to happen to him. And I was having an impact on him, I think, but he was having a big impact on me. So 5.5 months later, we go before the Superior Court judge in Dedham, and he stands before her, and she says to him, the judge, why did you plead guilty? I talked to your lawyer. He recommended that you not, and witnesses can come and go, and you defer these things. And he said, well, I know how I came in here, and I don't want to leave that same person. And he tells her something like that, and that's why I owned what I did. And she was quite puzzled by it. She looked at him, she said, I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to overturn the decision for you to go into the adult prison system and keep you in the juvenile system till you're 21. And that day, I left and I was like, wow. I knew I was called to work with leadership youth. I just didn't know it was these kids. But this kid at 15 would do something that I don't know many 35 or 55-year-olds willing to do. I don't know what I would do. Mm-hmm. And he was willing to put it on the line like that. And so I was hooked, and I just kept coming. And I've always seen them that way, as leaders, not as problems to be fixed, but as leaders. I mean, if you can make it out there when half the people are trying to kill you and the other half are trying to arrest you, you do have something going for you. Mm-hmm. And then you see a kid like Ricky who's willing to put it on the line at age 15 when it could cost him 20 years because he reads in the Bible, it says you're supposed to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And God shows up in those places when we really can't do it ourselves. We know that from almost everything. And it's a theory until it comes to a point like that. And so I began to work and see that these are the leaders I'm called to. And then I would say, a couple of months after that, I met Thomas Jefferson.
Okay. Yeah. Was this at Faneuil Hall? Or
no. He was turning 18. He was 17 years old.
Okay.
African-American kid from Roxbury. And he's like, hey, I'm going to be turning 18 and I got to leave here. And you hear that a lot from kids. I have to leave here. They can't, because they'll try to run away before they are going to get out. So they have to hold them longer. That's not unusual.
I'm sorry, I lost you there. So he's 18.
He's turning 18,
and he's worried when he says he has to leave. Is he in the prison system?
He's in the prison system
now, the juvenile system now.
Yeah, and he's turning 18, and he had tried to run away. They caught him, and they said, "But we still got to let you out at 18. We can't hold you anymore." He's like, "Well, if I run away, you got to extend my time." Well, we can't because you're turning 18. And so now he talks to me and he said, is there a place I can go? Because a lot of people want to kill me back in Boston. So Thomas is explaining this to me and I'm like, well, there's Teen Challenge. Well, what's that? What's a program for drugs? Well, no, I've been in programs since I was 13. He's like, I don't need another program. I said, well, like, he's describing really a family. A place I can belong, I can continue in this path. I really started, I feel like I've made some big changes, but I don't know if I can make it out there. So, well, do you know anybody positive out there? No. I said, okay, well, let me ask around. So I started to call around, people I know or churches, and I surprisingly couldn't find anybody willing and wanting to take in an 18-year-old gangbanger into their house, part of their family.
Sure.
And so I told him, I don't know any place, but I think it'd be good if you could find a good church. He said, "Oh, what's a good one? Wood, brick? I mean, how do you know?"
Yeah, sure.
And I said, just I'll be praying for you. And it seemed a bit empty, as he was getting out, and he got out and forgot about him, really. Like so many come and go, and until some weeks later, one of the staff at that facility said, "Oh, did you hear about Thomas Jefferson?" I said, "No." And he showed me this little blurb in the back of the Boston Globe. Thomas Jefferson found castrated and shot in the back of the head by a rival gang. And I remember at that point just saying, I'm not going to keep doing this. You get kids' hopes up, there's a way out, and there's really no way out. I mean, this kid was willing, wanted to do anything. There's nothing for him. And I'm not going to keep coming in here telling kids, because I see so many of them, the same thing. Then you get out and you go back to the same thing.
And this was still early on when you first...
Yeah.
Is this within the first year?
Yeah, this was in 1988.
First year within that you're working. Okay.
Yeah. And so I started to think about, what he was saying, what he was describing, and it really was a family, a place to belong. And it started to percolate in my wife and I's heart, and we ended up opening a home in 1990 that was really around what Thomas was describing. We started taking 7 boys at a time. They were done with their time, wasn't going to get them out early. So not a lot of kids, when time's up and you can go home, and you want to choose to do like what Thomas did. I don't want to go back. I need some time, to get strong. And so we took them in, and we lived as a family. Less than 6% of those kids were ever rearrested. We had 10 who were in for gang murder. Now today, under current laws, they would be in the adult system. They wouldn't get, life sentence without parole, but they would be treated as adults. But in those days, they were tried as juveniles. None of those reoffended.
Wow.
Most of them went on to college, and they're in their 40s now. A lot of them. We still spend holidays together, and I think that's what it takes. And there's a verse in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians 4:15, where the Apostle Paul says, "You might have had 10,000 teachers, but you didn't have any fathers. But I became your father in this gospel." And I think that's the work that is ours, is to find people who can become fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers in this gospel. And it's not to fix somebody. Ricky changed my life. So many of these young people, I don't think you can keep doing this without burning out unless you can see the gift in them. Somebody who's struggled through a lot more than me and is still standing, I have something to learn from them. And I continue to. If it was my job to fix them or change them, I've been done with this a long time ago.
It's an amazing story. And so, you had a couple of major experiences within the first 12 months of working. That story of Thomas Jefferson is devastating. You took that leap of just inviting people to come. You just created this whole infrastructure and invited people to come in to live with you. When was that? Was that a year or 2 years after when you first started?
Yeah, we started in 87. It took a little, we got the vision in 89 out of Thomas, and in 1990 we opened a home. And we had a separate apartment in there, but we ate meals together. We had 2 single guys that were working with us in the ministry that had other jobs that were sort of like big brothers, and we had 7 boys. And I never had an act of violence in my home. I never had a thing stolen from me. We had our times, believe me, and I had my worst exposed that I didn't even know I had. I had anger in me that I never knew I had, You got to think about it. I left my job as a stockbroker because I didn't find enough meaning in making money. But there's a subtle thing that starts to happen. I want to make a difference. And this is the insidious part. So, I look back and my making a difference is I'm going to make a difference in these juvenile offenders. But now I need them to succeed for me to have significance. And that's pretty twisted. Mm-hmm. Because, and they can sense that, like I got a lot at stake in them changing so that I can be significant. And so that sets up a lot of toxicity too, that we lived with in those 10 years. And it exposed, when you start to work with people like this, or, people get your heart and they expose your heart, and it's not a pretty sight, because it's a lot more about me than it is about you. It looks like I'm just serving you, but really, I'm as long as you turn out, I'm going to feel good. But if you don't turn out, then you're going to reflect bad on me, and that ain't going to, and we have that with our own kids and everybody else, right? I mean, it's just part of the human experience, and I had a lot of it. But then we had our own children midway through running this home. We didn't think we could have kids, and then 5 years in, we got pregnant, 2 within 15 months.
That's great.
So, as our kids got older, we needed to move out of that situation. But my kids still today have a lot of big brothers, who are still a part of their life, and my daughter's 25th birthday today, and she's got
congratulations.
Older guys who are 45 who, when she was when she was born, they were living in that house, and they were big brothers to her, and had never seen them as anything different than family.
And so now, flash forward till today, you are in 32 facilities, helping within 32 facilities in New England.
In Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts.
Yeah, 32 out of 40, but then throughout New England. So, it's 50 or so that people go into, but then we have affiliates in 12 states and work now a lot with, we were just in Florida this last weekend, and Tennessee this coming, to really bring together the church and individuals who have a calling toward this, that would really be good mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers. And they just don't know that there's juvenile jails, right near them, but they're all over the place. And they don't know how to get into there, because they're, the world of the church and the world of these are very separated. And it's not altogether bad, because church people aren't equipped often to go into there, but we try to get them equipped. I do a lot of online training schools and to get people equipped to go in so they can not be harmful, but be really useful and work with the kids when they come out. And, I've got a lot of kids now that I know, and it's just in Florida, and 3 that I was with there who came up through the system who are now serving. And that's just part of this narrative I talked about that has to be changed, that these kids have had a lot of trauma, but they're strong leaders. And while we've talked about individuals experiencing transformation, we've talked about the need for systems to transform, systemic racism and systemic injustice. Kids go back to communities, and one thing I've discovered is that the worst in the minds of people, gang members of the community, are the most powerful forces for change. And I think I learned that in the early 90s, when our director in Lynn used to invite the leaders of the different gangs. There were about a dozen pretty distinct gangs in Lynn at that time, over to her apartment for breakfast once a month. Different gang leaders, rivals.
Okay.
And they would talk about, what would you like to see in your city? And, there wasn't like to crush the Bloods or to take the Crips out. It was to have safer parks, to have more jobs. Mm-hmm. So safe at night, so our mothers or grandmothers could go out to the store and not be afraid. And they began to dream about what could be in the city of Lynn, rival gang members. And she began to encourage them, well, what do you think could be done? And they had the idea, well, what if we put basketball hoops back up in the parks because they were taken out because of gang violence. And they made a pitch to the mayor with our staff, and they got them put back in. And they said, "We'll make sure that there's no violence in there, in the parks." And they did. They navigated peace.
They were part of the decision-making process, part of the community part. So now you're introducing them back into the community, empowering them to make a change.
And they began to be with each other. And then they came up with the idea, well, what if we start a basketball league with rival gangs? And so they organized with one of our staff a basketball tournament with it ended up being 72 gang members from 12 gangs. And they put it together and they pulled it off without a hitch. And then they started to mix the youth up.
No violence.
Now this is no violence.
No problems.
And at this time, Lynn was the second most violent city in the Commonwealth here. And then we started to see that the people who were really leading the gangs were like out of our demographic. We're juvenile offender ministry. So they were like 23, 24, the OGs, the original gangsters. And a lot of them were locked up in the county jail, in the segregated gang blocks. And so we started to go in there and work with those guys. And I remember being in one of those meetings when one of the Bloods, the Bloods and the Crips, like the Republicans and the Democrats, the blue and the red.
Sure, yeah.
So one of the Bloods on the gang block wrote a letter to have read to the Crips, and I still have it, and it said, I'd be willing to take a bullet for you guys, you Crips, if it could bring peace to our streets of Lynn. And they heard it, and they were like, well, what could we do? And we organized with the administration coming on board a 3-day event we called Ready for Life, where we brought together 16 of the Bloods and 16 Crips leaders in Lynn. Now, they'd all violated against each other. They all knew each other. We brought them together for 3 days. And we did this intensive leadership development. This Ready for Life program came out of something I experienced that for the business community, cost $2,500. The guy that designed it with me did it with Disney, ABC, ESPN executives. We reworked it, same material for gang leaders. We didn't dumb it down. We did it 3 days, and those guys reconciled. They asked each other forgiveness. And we didn't even tell them to do it, but that's what came out of it. They were then put back into their segregated gang blocks where they're locked down 23 hours a day. So 120 guys in the gang units out of 1,400 in the county jail. And they navigated peace on the streets of Lynn.
Wow.
That weekend, we would run a basketball league. Bloods one Friday, Crips the next, Bloods, and they all came together. We said, uh-oh, what's going on? They said, no, peace has been already all negotiated from inside. And the city started to change. Now, Lynn's not even in the top 10 most violent cities anymore. But the story that's not really told is how these guys who were the supposed problems got on the same page for a vision bigger than just, snuffing each other out. To what do we want to see in our city? And we hired a bunch of those guys on our staff. They didn't all work out, but there were rivals who began to serve together.
Wow.
And so I think that's, when I talk about rewriting the narrative of who these kids are, they're a very small segment of the population, but they commit over half the crimes. So they would be strategic that way. They're leaders. One of them, is very expensive if we don't step in and work with them.
Sure.
$2.1 million, one kid over his lifetime of lost taxes and cost of incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't understand why we're not a lot more intentional about getting these kids, especially when they're in a place where they're open, and instead of forget about them or that's what we're trying to do.
It seems like there's first of all, that's an unbelievable story, and I can see where if you're leading a gang, then you certainly have leadership skills, and it's interesting that some people just adding their time and bringing people together trying to leverage those leadership skills in an effort to do something positive. How well that turns out, it seems like there could be a lot of opportunities that for everybody to do something similar that might be right under our nose. So, we have just scratched the surface of all the things that you have done and do, and your team and group and volunteers. If someone's watching this and wants to get involved, what is the best way to get in touch with your organization?
Yeah. Straightahead.org is our website. At scott@straightahead.org.
Okay. Cool.
And we have opportunities for people to do all kinds of different things, volunteering, supporting, hiring a young person when they come out. It's a village, right? It's a community task and a societal one. And when we at least begin to shift, hopefully a little bit about who these young people are, then we're more prone to move toward them than against them.
I would have to agree wholeheartedly. Will you come back? Because I feel like there's so much more to cover. And I know you have an obligation to get to. It's inspirational what you're talking about. And in some way, I hope that having you on this podcast might excite some people to take action. And you've definitely shown that it's achievable, making that shift from kind of a fearful thinking and to a thought of love and what it can do. So thank you for being here. I can't thank you enough. I hope to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Thank you.